The autumn wind carried dust through the streets of Silver Creek, Arizona Territory in 1887, swirling around the weathered boots of those gathered outside the courthouse. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and tension as Judge Harrison Mills presided over what many considered a routine land dispute. The courtroom was packed with ranchers, miners, and townspeople, all eager to witness what they believed would be a swift resolution to remove the last obstacle preventing the expansion of the Silver Creek Mining Company's operations. At the defendant's table sat an elderly Apache man named Nish, whose weathered hands rested calmly on the wooden surface before him. His long gray hair was braided with strips of leather, and his dark eyes held the wisdom of 7 decades spent under the vast Arizona sky. He wore simple clothes, a worn cotton shirt and dark trousers, but around his neck hung a silver medallion that caught the afternoon light streaming through the courthouse windows. The medallion bore symbols that few in the room could understand, ancient Apache markings that told the story of his lineage and connection to the land in question. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man from Phoenix named Charles Whitmore, stood before the jury with confidence radiating from every gesture. He represented the mining company and had built his reputation on cases just like this one, removing what he called obstacles to progress and civilization. As he began his opening statement, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to winning. The land in dispute was a 40-acre parcel along Willow Creek, where Nish had lived for over 30 years, in a small adobe house he had built with his own hands. The mining company claimed the land had been improperly surveyed in previous years and that Nish had no legal claim to it. They wanted to expand their copper mining operation, and the creek provided the water source they needed for their growing enterprise. Whitmore paced before the jury, his polished shoes clicking against the wooden floor. He spoke of progress, of jobs for the community, of the tax revenue the expanded mining operation would bring to Silver Creek. He painted Nish as a relic of a bygone era, clinging to land that could serve a greater purpose. When he gestured toward the old Apache man, several members of the gallery chuckled, and a few made derisive comments under their breath. Judge Mills, a portly man with a grey beard who had been on the bench for 15 years, seemed to barely tolerate the proceedings. He had presided over dozens of similar cases, and the outcome was rarely in doubt. The law, as it stood, favored those who could present proper documentation and legal representation, advantages that men like Nish rarely possessed. When it came time for Nish to present his case, he had no lawyer. The court had appointed a young man named Robert Fletcher to represent him, but Fletcher was fresh out of law school and had little experience with such cases. He did his best to argue that Nish had lived on the land longer than anyone could remember, that he had improved it and cared for it, but his arguments sounded weak against Whitmore's polished presentation. The mining company had brought surveyor reports, county records, and testimony from several prominent citizens who supported their claim. They argued that the original survey had been flawed and that the land rightfully belonged to the territorial government, which had the authority to lease it to the mining company. The evidence seemed overwhelming, and several jury members appeared to have already made up their minds. Throughout the proceedings, Nish sat quietly, his expression never changing even as laughter and jeers occasionally erupted from the gallery. When Whitmore made particularly cutting remarks about the need to clear the land of squatters and bring it into productive use, some in the crowd openly mocked the old Apache man. They called him names in voices just loud enough to be heard, but not quite loud enough for the judge to take action. The morning session continued, with witness after witness testifying in favor of the mining company. The mine foreman spoke of the jobs that would be created. The company's surveyor presented his findings with charts and maps. A local merchant testified about the economic benefits the expansion would bring to the town. Each witness painted Nish as an obstacle to prosperity, a man clinging to the past while progress waited. During the lunch recess, most people filed out of the courthouse to eat at the nearby saloons and boarding houses. Nalnish remained seated, opening a small cloth bundle that contained jerky and cornbread. He ate slowly and in silence, occasionally looking out the window at the mountains that rose beyond the town. A few people pointed at him as they passed, making comments about the stubborn old Indian who thought he could stand in the way of civilization. Among those who remained in the courthouse during the break was a young woman named Sarah Catherine Morrison, a schoolteacher who had arrived in Silver Creek only 6 months earlier from Boston. She was 24 years old, with auburn hair pinned back in a simple bun and wearing a modest blue dress that marked her as someone of education and refinement. Sarah had been watching the proceedings with growing discomfort, disturbed by the way Nalnish was being treated. Sarah had come to Arizona Territory to teach at the newly established Silver Creek School, bringing with her not only a classical education, but also a curiosity about the cultures and peoples of the West. Unlike many of the recent arrivals to the territory, she had made an effort to learn about the Apache people and their history. She had read everything she could find about their traditions, their language, and their deep connection to the land. As the afternoon session began, Whitmore called his final witnesses and prepared to rest his case. The evidence seemed insurmountable, and even young Fletcher appeared resigned to defeat. Judge Mills looked at his pocket watch several times, clearly eager to conclude the proceedings and render what everyone expected to be a swift verdict in favor of the mining company. It was then that Sarah Morrison stood up from her seat in the gallery. The sudden movement caught everyone's attention, including Judge Mills, who looked annoyed at the interruption. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice clear and steady despite the nervousness she felt, "I request permission to address the court." Judge Mills frowned and adjusted his spectacles. "Miss, this is not a public forum. Unless you have direct evidence to present in this case, I must ask you to remain seated." Sarah took a deep breath. She had spent the lunch recess making a decision that could change everything, though she had no way of knowing the full impact of what she was about to do. "I do have something to present, Your Honor. I have been living in this community for 6 months, and I have taken the time to learn about its history and its people. I believe the court has not heard the full story of this land and its significance." Whitmore objected immediately, arguing that the young woman had no standing in the case and that her testimony would be irrelevant. But Sarah had anticipated this response and had prepared her argument carefully. "Your Honor," she continued, "I am not here to testify about legal documents or survey markers. I'm here to provide context that I believe is essential to understanding the true nature of this dispute. The court has heard extensive testimony about the economic value of this land and its potential for mining operations, but no one has spoken about its cultural and historical significance to the Apache people who have lived here for generations." Judge Mills looked uncertain. The law was clear about who could testify and under what circumstances, but Sarah's request was unusual enough that he wasn't sure how to proceed. The gallery had fallen silent, curious to see what the young schoolteacher had in mind. After a moment's consideration, Judge Mills made his decision. "Miss Morrison, I will allow you to make a brief statement, but it must be relevant to the legal issues before this court. You may not turn this proceeding into a lecture on local history." Sarah nodded and walked to the front of the courtroom. As she passed Nalnish's table, she stopped and did something that shocked everyone present. She turned to face the old Apache man and spoke to him in his own language, using words she had learned through careful study and practice. Nalnish looked up at her in surprise, his calm expression giving way to wonder as she continued speaking in Apache. Her pronunciation was careful but respectful, and though her vocabulary was limited, her meaning was clear. She was asking for his blessing to speak on behalf of his people and his connection to the land. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers as people tried to understand what was happening. Many had never heard Apache spoken aloud, and the musical quality of the language was unlike anything they expected. Some in the gallery laughed nervously, unsure how to react to this unprecedented turn of events. Nalnish studied Sarah's face carefully, seeing something in her eyes that he had not expected to find in that courtroom. After a long moment, he nodded slowly and responded in Apache, his voice carrying the weight of years and the dignity of his people. He gave her his blessing and more, acknowledging her respect for his culture and her willingness to stand up when others would not. Sarah bowed her head slightly in thanks, then turned to address the court. The room had grown quiet again, but the atmosphere had changed. Something significant had just happened, though many present could not quite understand what it was. "Your Honor and members of the jury," Sarah began, her voice steady and strong. "What you have just witnessed is a conversation in the Apache language, a tongue that has been spoken in this region for centuries before any of us arrived. I asked Mr. Nalnish for permission to speak about his people's connection to this land, and he has given me his blessing to do so." She paused, looking around the courtroom at faces that showed a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and in some cases, hostility. But she also saw something else, a recognition that they were witnessing something important, something that went beyond the usual legal proceedings they had expected. The land that is the subject of this dispute is not just 40 acres along Willow Creek, Sarah continued. To the Apache people, it is part of a sacred landscape that has been home to their ancestors for generations beyond counting. The creek that the mining company wishes to use for their operations is known to the Apache as the place where the water spirits dwell, where young people come of age, and where the dead are honored according to ancient traditions. Whitmore started to object, but Judge Mills raised his hand to silence him. The judge was clearly intrigued by what he was hearing, and he wanted to allow Sarah to continue. "I am not arguing against progress or economic development," Sarah said, addressing the concerns she knew many in the room would have. "I am simply asking that we consider the full cost of our actions and the full value of what we might be destroying. Mr. Nalnish has lived on this land for 30 years, caring for it, protecting the water source, and maintaining the traditions of his people. He has never prevented others from using the creek, never charged for access, never interfered with the legitimate activities of his neighbors." She gestured toward Nalnish, who continued to sit quietly, but whose presence seemed to command more respect than it had at the beginning of the day. "The old Apache man who has been mocked and dismissed in this courtroom today is a keeper of knowledge that stretches back centuries. He knows the names of every plant that grows along that creek, the habits of every animal that drinks from its waters, and the stories of every Apache family that has called this place home." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued, her passion for justice overcoming her nervousness. She spoke about the Apache way of life, their respect for the land, and their understanding of the delicate balance that must be maintained between human needs and natural resources. She talked about the mistakes that had been made in other parts of the territory, where mining operations had polluted water sources and destroyed landscapes that could never be restored. As she spoke, something remarkable began to happen in the courtroom. The laughter and jeering that had marked the earlier proceedings gave way to thoughtful silence. Even some of the mining company's supporters seemed to be reconsidering their position as they heard Sarah's eloquent defense of Nalnish and his people. But Sarah was not finished. She had saved her most powerful argument for last, and she delivered it with the skill of someone who truly understood both the law and the deeper principles of justice that the law was meant to serve. "Your Honor," she said, turning to face Judge Mills directly, "this case is not ultimately about survey lines or mineral rights or economic development. It is about what kind of community we want to build in Silver Creek and what kind of people we want to be. The decision you make today will be remembered long after the copper is mined and the profits are spent. It will become part of the story we tell about ourselves and our values. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. We have the opportunity to show that progress and respect can coexist, that development and tradition need not be enemies. We can find a way to honor both the economic needs of our growing community and the cultural heritage of the people who called this place home long before any of us arrived. Sarah then did something that surprised even herself. She turned back to Nalnish and spoke to him again in Apache, asking him to share with the court something about his connection to the land. The old man stood slowly, his dignity intact, despite the humiliation he had endured throughout the day. Nalnish spoke in Apache for several minutes, his voice carrying the rhythm and cadence of traditional storytelling. Though most in the courtroom could not understand his words, they could feel the power and sincerity of what he was saying. He spoke of his childhood along Willow Creek, of learning to hunt and fish in its waters, of the sacred ceremonies that had been performed on its banks. When he finished speaking, Sarah translated his words for the court, capturing not just their literal meaning, but their emotional and spiritual significance. She spoke of his promise to care for the land, his role as a guardian of the water, and his willingness to share the bounty of the creek with all who respected it. The impact of this exchange was profound. Several members of the jury were visibly moved, and even Judge Mills seemed to be reconsidering the case before him. The mockery and derision that had marked the earlier proceedings had given way to something approaching reverence, as people began to understand the depth of Nalnish's connection to the disputed land. Whitmore attempted to regain control of the proceedings by objecting to what he called irrelevant testimony and emotional manipulation. He argued that the case was about legal rights, not cultural traditions, and that the court had no authority to consider such matters, but his objections sounded hollow after what the court had just witnessed. Judge Mills called for a brief recess to consider the unusual turn the case had taken. During the break, the atmosphere in the courtroom was dramatically different from what it had been in the morning. People spoke in hushed tones about what they had witnessed, and many who had come to see Nalnish humiliated found themselves instead feeling ashamed of their earlier behavior. Sarah spent the recess sitting with Nalnish, continuing their conversation in Apache and learning more about his life and his people's history. Word of what was happening in the courtroom began to spread through the town, and by the time Judge Mills returned to the bench, the gallery was packed with curious onlookers who had heard about the remarkable events taking place. When court resumed, Judge Mills announced that he wanted to hear from Nalnish himself, with Sarah serving as translator. This was highly unusual, as Apache testimony was rarely taken seriously in territorial courts. But the judge seemed determined to understand the full scope of the case before him. Through Sarah's translation, Nalnish told his story to the court. He spoke of arriving at Willow Creek as a young man, of building his home with his own hands, of raising his children there before they moved on to their own lives. He talked about the years of drought when he had carefully managed the water to ensure that both human and animal life could survive. He described the plants he had cultivated, the wildlife he had protected, and the way he had served as an unofficial guardian of the creek for 3 decades. Most importantly, he spoke about his willingness to share the land with others, including the mining company, if they would agree to respect the water source and the sacred sites that meant so much to his people. He was not asking to stop all development, only to ensure that it was done in a way that honored the land and preserved its essential character. As Nalnish's testimony continued, it became clear that this was not the stubborn, unreasonable man that the mining company's lawyers had portrayed. Instead, he emerged as someone who had spent his life caring for a piece of the earth and was now asking only that his stewardship be recognized and his people's traditions be respected. The transformation in the courtroom was remarkable. People who had arrived that morning ready to see the old Apache man removed from his land were now listening intently to his words and beginning to understand the complexity of the issues at stake. Some of the miners and ranchers who had supported the mining company began to shift uncomfortably in their seats as they realized the full implications of what they were asking the court to do. When Nalnish finished speaking, Judge Mills faced a decision unlike any he had encountered in his years on the bench. The law was clear about property rights and mineral claims, but he had just heard testimony that went far beyond legal technicalities to touch on fundamental questions of justice and human dignity. After a long moment of consideration, Judge Mills announced his decision. He acknowledged the mining company's legal claims, but ruled that Nalnish had demonstrated a legitimate interest in the land that deserved protection. Rather than ordering his removal, the judge mandated that the two parties work together to find a solution that would allow the mining operation to proceed while preserving Nalnish's home and protecting the most environmentally and culturally sensitive areas of the creek. The decision was unprecedented, and it sent shockwaves through the territorial legal system. More importantly, it established a precedent for considering the rights and interests of Native Americans in land disputes, something that would have lasting implications throughout the Southwest. But the most immediate impact was on the people of Silver Creek themselves. Sarah Morrison's courageous stand and Nalnish's dignified testimony had opened their eyes to perspectives they had never considered. The young schoolteacher who had arrived from Boston had not only saved an old Apache man's home, but had also helped her community discover something important about itself. In the months that followed, Sarah continued to serve as a bridge between the Anglo and Apache communities in Silver Creek. She expanded her language studies and began incorporating Apache history and culture into her school curriculum. Nalnish became a frequent visitor to the school, sharing stories and traditions with the children of the town that had once mocked him. The mining company, forced to work within the constraints established by Judge Mills, found ways to expand their operation while respecting the creek and the cultural sites that Nalnish had identified as sacred. The compromise was not perfect, but it demonstrated that cooperation was possible when people were willing to listen to each other and seek common ground. Sarah Morrison never returned to Boston. She made Silver Creek her permanent home, eventually marrying a local rancher and raising a family that grew up bilingual in English and Apache. Her children learned to see the Arizona landscape through both Anglo and Native American eyes, understanding that the land could be both a source of economic opportunity and a sacred trust to be protected for future generations. Nalnish lived for many more years beside Willow Creek, serving as a keeper of Apache traditions and a bridge between worlds that had once seemed impossibly far apart. He became a respected elder in the community, consulted on matters ranging from water rights to weather patterns. When he finally passed away at the age of 87, he was mourned by both Apache and Anglo residents of Silver Creek, all of whom had come to understand the wisdom he had shared and the example he had set. The courthouse, where the remarkable events of that autumn day had unfolded, became something of a landmark, with visitors coming from across the territory to hear the story of the old Apache man who had been mocked until a young schoolteacher asked for his blessing in his own language. The story spread throughout the Southwest, inspiring similar acts of courage and understanding in other communities struggling with questions of development, tradition, and justice. Judge Mills, whose career had been changed by the case, went on to become known as a champion of minority rights and cultural preservation. He often spoke about the day when a young woman's knowledge of the Apache language had opened his eyes to dimensions of justice he had never considered before. The case of Nalnish versus Silver Creek Mining Company became a turning point not just for one old man or one small town, but for the entire relationship between Native American communities and the territorial legal system. It demonstrated that respect and understanding could bridge even the widest cultural divides, and that justice was not just about legal precedents, but about recognizing the full humanity of all people who came before the court. Years later, when historians looked back on the development of the American Southwest, they would identify that autumn day in Silver Creek as a moment when the region began to find a way to honor both its future and its past, its economic potential and its cultural heritage. It all began when an elderly Apache man was mocked in court until a white teacher asked for his blessing in his language, and in doing so reminded everyone present that dignity and respect know no boundaries of race or culture. The story of that day became part of the folklore of Silver Creek, told and retold by generations of residents who understood that their community had been forever changed by the courage of two people who chose to reach across the divisions that separated them. Sarah Morrison and Nalnish had shown that even in the harsh and often unforgiving world of the Old West, compassion and understanding could prevail over prejudice and fear. If you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, justice, and the remarkable people who shaped the American frontier. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's courage changed an entire community? Or perhaps you know of other stories where understanding triumphed over prejudice. Share your thoughts and help us continue exploring the rich history of the American West together.